welcome everyone to the Ascent tutorial. So we're going to be talking about Ascent, which is a library that you use for in situ visualization analysis inside of HPC simulation. So my name is Cyrus. I'm going to be presenting along with Nicole and Justin. So Nicole, why don't you unmute and say hi real quick?
Hi, everyone.
All right. And Justin, you can also unmute and say hi. Make sure we can hear you.
Hello.
All right. So this is being recorded. So it's being recorded and it will be made available in the future. So just note that you're attending a recorded presentation. So what we're going to be doing here today is we're going to be learning about Ascent. We're going to have some slides that set the stage for what in situ visualization is, how it differs a little bit from post hoc, which is what most people do in their daily lives. We're going to have a short introduction to Ascent's capabilities and a little bit of history, and then most of the time we're going to spend inside of tutorial notebooks. So that's the plan. So before we get started, I want to thank folks who have funded us. So Ascent was part of the ECP program, but it's also part of the ASC program. And over several years, the support that the lab has been given and we've been given has allowed us to build this tool, which we're excited about and we have fun developing. So thank you to our folks who have funded this work. Again, we're going to talk about a little bit about what in situ visualization is in general, just to set the stage. And then I'm going to give you an introduction to Ascent itself, some of the features and things like that in a PowerPoint form. And most of the time, we're going to be working on tutorials that are hosted in these Jupyter notebooks on AWS. So when we get there, I'll tell you some more instructions. But if you're behind a VPN or if you're on site at Livermore, for example, you might have to do some extra steps to be able to request to connect to these servers because they're just running on non-standard ports, they're random IPs. So just a heads up on that, but we'll get you sorted out on that. So we're part of the visit team. So again, myself, Justin, Nicole, and there's several others who are part of the visit team too at Livermore. What we do is we build open source visualization analysis and IO tools. So Visit is our big flagship product that we build. It's a end-to-end application for doing visualization of simulation data. So it's got a lot of features. It has a long history. And again, it's kind of kitchen sink, right? It's got everything in there. Ascent is our newer capability. So it's a in situ visualization library linked directly into your code. So it's meant to be more streamlined and it's meant to focus on, use cases of while you're running your simulation, prescribing how to make pictures or how to extract data. The other two major products that we work on are Conduit. Conduit's a library for describing data in memory and passing it, hopefully zero copy between different parts of the ecosystem. And it's also used to share mesh data heavily in Ascent, so you're going to learn about that. Then the other tool we work on is Silo. Silo is a file format, checkpoint restart, and kind of a mesh-based data model that's also a several decade capability that a lot of our codes use for doing checkpoint restart and for all their visualization files. So that's us, and we're going to focus today talking about Ascent. So what is Ascent? So it's a we call it a flyweight in situ visualization analysis library. We call it that because it's meant to be targeted to be small compared to other capabilities. It focuses on a few use cases. So obviously rendering is important for visualization, so making pictures. There's a lot of features in there for transforming data and also capturing data. So you're never going to be able to do everything that you want to do in a tool like Ascent. So we think it's very important to be able to get things out, say in HDF5 formats and things like that, so you can do other analysis. It's a young effort, I guess. In the grand scheme of things, maybe we wouldn't say this anymore. It's about 8 years old, right? It does support the common visualization operations, the bread and butter of what people do day to day. It provides a nice infrastructure to integrate custom analysis, so there's a way to register your own filters. Hasn't been heavily used, but it's effectively what we use to put new features into Ascent. It has C, C++, Python, and Fortran APIs because those are our favorite simulation code languages. And so we wanted to make it easy to use. We wanted to make it directly linked into simulation codes. And it was really important for us to have a kind of a smaller footprint. So this flyweight design. So we do things with MPI, right? So it's an MPI code. And we also support many cores, so CUDA, HIP, OpenMP, et cetera, to run on GPUs. And it has been demonstrated to scale very well. So even back in 19, in not in 19, sorry, in 2018, we ran all of LLML Sierra cluster and did ray tracing and filtering there, and that was a nice thing to demonstrate this capability. Since then, we've been running on a bunch of different systems. It has lower memory requirements than other tools in that it tries to be efficient with what intermediate data it uses, but also it requires less libraries. So less libraries require the application chewing up less space. And then there's a lot fewer dependencies. So for example, we don't require windowing libraries or OpenGL or anything like that. So let's talk a little bit about what in situ processing is and give you some kind of just a ground floor for what's going on with in situ processing. So when you want to do scientific visualization, you use one of these tools, right? So these tools help you do things like change your data. Maybe that's some sort of geometric change, or it could be something feature-based. They help you analyze data, and they also help you make pictures, right? So to do that, we have to present them with data about basically descriptions and data about what our mesh is. And we also have to present them with what we call actions, like the things you want to do. So you say, here's my mesh, and I'd like to make a picture of it, right? So this is how scientific visualization tools work, whether they're post hoc tools or whether they're in situ tools. And these tools are really used to support a lot of different things, right? So you might just think of movie making and presentation graphics, which is important, and that's the fanciest stuff you see in people's proposals or in people's papers. Yes, we need features for doing presentation graphics and making very nice pictures, but the reality is day to day, scientists running their simulations need a lot of tools to just hack at and ask and answer questions about their data. So mostly these tools are used for data exploration, and it's the user of the simulation code getting in there and trying to figure out what's going on and using a whole suite of tools to do that. There's also tools for quantitative analysis, like you'd like to get curves out, right? So this example shows basically extracting out a heartbeat from a simulation, so based on the pressure. Another really important use case is visual debugging, especially if you're a simulation code developer. Often things, you can have some pretty crazy bugs in your code, or you can have tangled zones, and it helps to have visual context for understanding when things are going wrong. So like being able to look at that tangled zone in a visualization tool is very helpful for you to understand where it's happening or what's around it. Another really important use case is comparative analysis. This is where you maybe render two pictures of a similar thing and you use your brain to compare them, or you could do it more systematically in a tool. You could subtract fields from each other. So these are kind of the 5 big use cases that visualization tools are used for, and these are used daily by scientists who run simulations, right? So there's kind of 2 ways of doing things. So post hoc means after the fact. So this is how most people do things. They run a simulation. While the simulation is running, they occasionally write out checkpoints, and then they come back and then they go and look through the time series of these checkpoints, and they ask and answer questions, and they kind of iterate. And then in situ means doing it while it's generating. So instead of writing the files and coming back later, while the simulation is running, you're going to share some of the compute resources with the simulation, and from there, you're going to try to get pictures out or try to get further artifacts out that help you do your science, right? So post hoc is by far the most widely used, right? So again, you're running your simulation code. Every once in a while, it's going to save the state to the file system. That's probably for each time. It's a set of checkpoints, a whole bunch of files at each time step. And then there's some periodic frequency that happens. And then after the fact, someone comes up and picks up all those files, and then they apply these actions to make pictures, right? Or to transform the data. So in situ processing happens again while the data is being generated, and one of the benefits is that it expands the data we can access. So the reason why is, especially at scale, I/O is a lot more expensive than compute, right? So if you can prescribe what you'd like to do while your application is running, you can avoid those I/O costs. So that's why people are interested in situ. People are also interested in situ for things that they know that are kind of cookie cutter recipe things that they always want to do, and they don't want to go in after the fact and have to think about things. But one of the pros is, again, you have reduced I/O, right? Another important thing, this is also important for machine learning applications, is you can get all the simulation data. Because the I/O costs are lower, you can actually call in situ. There's still a cost to doing the processing, but you can call those and you can theoretically publish all the data from the meshes at whatever time frequency you want to. You do have the computational power. Usually when people are doing post hoc, they don't use the same amount of resources as that was used to run the simulation code, but you're right there in the simulation code. So you have all the same resources the simulation code is running. And then at the end of the day, your simulation is done. Great. You have everything's ready, right? So that's nice. There are some cons though, right? There's this a priori challenge, right? You kind of need to know what you want to do before you do it. So those exploratory cases can be limited, even though we have some features to help with that. It increases the complexity of running the simulation code itself, right? Because now you have to run the simulation code and then you have to set up kind of input parameters for your visualization as well. And then while we're running right next to the simulation code, that's great, but there are constraints, right? The simulation code is king and wants to have all the memory and wants to have all the GPUs. So we may not have as much resources as if we were running isolated another process. So, this is the story, right? To think about, if depending on how things are going and depending on what scales you're running out, the compute speed does always outwin the IO, right? And that can favor in situ processing, right? If you're running at small scales, it's not going to matter. You're not going to notice it. But when you start to run at moderate or large scales, you'll notice that, hey, writing a checkpoint takes a long time, and that's, all the state. And it might be possible to do, several renders in between in the same time. So there's also a more complicated paradigm, which is we call it part of in situ, but it's called in transit. And the thinking there is that you can run, and when you run, instead of doing it right inside the simulation itself, you can quickly transfer the data to another set of resources and then overlap the in situ processing, and have it run in parallel with the simulation. So this increases the complexity, but it also has the possibility of squeezing out more and more, more and more results as the simulation code's running. And there are lots of considerations. So this is a paper that was worked upon by the visualization community led by Hank Childs. And they really talked about just trying to systematically think about all the considerations of that impact in situ. So I think if you're deeply interested, you can learn about this and learn about some of the different ways. Today we're going to be talking about something that's tightly coupled into the application using the same memory space. That's the way we're going to be sharing how Ascent is done today. So in order to use our visualization tools, we got to provide mesh data, we got to provide actions, right? So the question is, how do we pass simulation data to Ascent? So the world of HPC simulations is wide and complicated, right? So there are lots and lots of ways that people represent their mesh data. So a lot of simulation codes have their own, memory models for what's a mesh, what's a structured grid, et cetera. And then there's other tools that have kind of a toolkit or a framework or API that provide mesh features, so like BTK, BTKM, MFEM, et cetera. So, and then beyond the simulation world, there's a whole bunch of analysis tools that are completely mesh agnostic. So thinking about things like NumPy and PyTorch, they don't understand what an unstructured grid is, right? So coupling between mesh data, in some of these concrete frameworks or bespoke data, all of this is a challenge. And we make the point that we don't think there will ever be a magical API that solves all these things. So what we did is we developed this thing called Mesh Blueprint that provides a way of describing and hopefully quickly adapting data between a wide range of APIs. So Conduit's what we use. So that's the answer to mesh data for Ascent, and that's also the interface. If you're familiar with Catalyst, Catalyst is an in situ visualization tool that the pair of you folks build. They also adopted Conduit as their mesh data interface. So what is Conduit? I talked about it briefly. but it's something that helps us describe and pass data around in memory. So it gives you a human-friendly way of basically building trees of data. An important feature is that you can describe arrays without copying them. So it can both own data, or it can have data that's basically described to it and hand that around. It provides C, C++, Python, and Fortran APIs, and also really, since Ascent's API heavily relies on Conduit, it's really Conduit that provides that for Ascent as well. And then building on top of this kind of tree structure that we have that's very flexible, we also have common conventions for sharing simulation meshes. So when we present data, how do we know how do we know there's a field on a mesh, right? Things like that. So we have conventions for that, and we have runtime checks and things of that nature. So the other thing that's interesting about Conduit is once you've described things very well in memory, then a lot of the other features can fall out in terms of I/O, right? So checkpoint restart or shipping things around with MPI. So it helps with all those things. And Blueprint, which I mentioned before, is a library that gives us tools related to sharing, in particular, mesh data, right? And it also provides a lot of examples of the types of data. So like a lot of the things that we do in test and Ascent are using the Conduit examples for, say, an AMR mesh or a unstructured grid, right? So we're going to share some examples in the hands-on session of what a blueprint mesh is. This is one of the most basic examples of it here, represented in a YAML format. So in memory, it's not YAML, right? It's not a string format, but it can be converted to YAML for human consumption. So in this case, we'll go through these rules with you, but the mesh on the left here is an example output, and describes this unstructured tet mesh with two tets and a trivial field on it. So we got that answer, mesh blueprint data. How do we pass user actions to Ascent? Well, the answer is also Conduit. So Conduit makes it very easy to create these trees. We use these trees to create user APIs. And when we're doing the hands-on, you'll learn a lot about this. In the hands-on, we will show you how to build these trees in Python, but they also can be accepted in YAML. And building them in C++ is very similar to building them in Python. Okay, so that is our introduction to in situ concepts. And now I'm going to talk briefly about Ascent itself. I already went through this slide. Again, our goal was to create an easy to use library that could be linked directly in with some of the principles shown here. It supports a lot of the bread and butter you would expect to do in your daily life, right? If you're doing visualization. So obviously things like rendering, pseudo color, volume rendering, ways of transforming the data, like taking contours or subvolumes, which is an isovolume, threshold, slicing, clipping, and underpinning Ascent itself are several technologies that help us get the job done. So VTKM, which has actually been renamed to VisCores, is a performance portable library for visualization operations that we use heavily to target GPUs. We also use Raja, which is a performance portability layer for writing general code for HPC. We leverage MFEM for high order meshes, and also a custom ray tracer for high order meshes called Devil Ray. So in addition to some of the rendering stuff, we also have analysis features, right? So ability to create dry fields. So that's the ability to on the fly compute new fields from existing ones. Very important things like time histories, lineouts, binning. Another area where we spent a lot of I guess research effort and implementation effort was triggers. So I mentioned before that people can be scared of this a priori problem. Well, I don't really know when the important things are going to happen inside of my simulation, right? I need to run it, and I'm worried I'm going to miss something. So triggers can't completely solve that problem, but they can help you prescribe conditions that you deem as interesting, and then you can spend your visualization resources, spend your time executing there and maybe extract some data and save them out. So this example just shows, hey, when the entropy jumps, I'd like to do something, right? And then finally, we have extracts. Extracts are a way to get data out of Ascent. Ascent's not going to do everything for you. It's not going to get your final answer, right? So we have ways of saving HDF5 files. We have ways of dropping into Python and Jupyter, creating something called a cinema database, which is another way to kind of shake off this a priori fear. We'll talk to you about that later in the tutorial. And then also it can create scalar images. This is an important feature. if you're doing your rendering and you think you have a problem with your color map, and you're nervous about getting the exact perfect color map, well, scalar image is designed to solve this. So instead of rendering out something with RGB colors, you actually do a ray trace and you save out the floating point values that those rays touched. And when you save that out, then you can go back after the fact and you can tweak your color maps, right? So that's a handy thing to do. So Ascent is being used at scale on Department of Energy's exascale supercomputers. So at Livermore, we're using it on El Capitan, and we are continuing to increase the use cases for that. One of the big things that we're seeing in a use case for Ascent is to help get data out or help reduce data for machine learning models. So an at-scale simulation isn't, you're not going to be able to save out all that data and hand it to a machine learning model to train on. So you might need to do something where you do a scalar render, or you might need to do something where you save out a cube of data, and Ascent can help with all that. Another really great image that we see here is so Mark Laurie at NASA Langley and his team were doing some really exciting runs on Frontier and for some aerospace stuff. And there's a link to the paper. It's really cool stuff. So he was working with us and we were helping him debug different issues. And I want to say, Ascent itself and where it is now on these computers is the result of a lot of work. So about 10 years ago, we created a proxy app before we created Ascent to demonstrate some of the concepts. And then through the ECP program, we and other important teams like the VTKM BizCores team built up this capability, and that's where we are today. So it's not like we did this in a vacuum. We did this with a lot of help from the community. All right, so we just released Ascent this July, technically last Friday, so it's definitely this July. So here are some of the highlights. I mean, some of this won't mean much to you if you don't know about Ascent, but upgrading to a new version of VTKM was very important. This is the last version of that library called VTKM, and then effectively that version becomes this new product called BizCores. We've been expanding the capabilities we have for extracts. An important one for Livermore folks is our silo support, reworking infrastructure for logging, adding a whole bunch of new features. Right. So this is a lot of work that we've put into this, and we're excited about this release. So today you get to learn about Ascent, and you get to learn about what it can do. Right. So you're going to learn how to use Conduit, since Conduit's so integral to actually doing Ascent's API. We'll talk a little bit about how to get your simulation data into Ascent for some simple cases. Some of you are probably might already be running codes that have a path to Ascent. So like, there's a way to wrap MFEM data pretty easily. There's a way to wrap AMRX data pretty easily. And some of you already have codes that have Ascent built in, but we still want to give you context of that. And then finally, you're going to spend a lot of time, asking Ascent to do things for you and getting some pictures out. So all the examples are outlined in our documentation. So our documentation's at ascentav.org. So you can get there and you can click on tutorial. But before we drop into that, I just want to talk about what the API looks like. So there's only really 5 top level functions in Ascent. So open and close are the least surprising. So they kind of set the stage and tear down the stage for using Ascent, right? So initialize and finalize. Publish is what you use to pass data into Ascent. So you hand it what's a conduit tree that has a description of your meshes. Executes where you ask Ascent what to do. And then info will give you kind of a summary of what happened, right? So publish, execute, and info all use this trick where they have one argument. That argument is a conduit tree, right? So that simplifies the API. Again, conduit's used to help out with this. So I mentioned this before. The reason why Ascent supports those language types is because Conduit provides great support for them. YAML is really the primary way that people use Ascent, particularly if they're iterating on things, because it allows you to provide a YAML file at runtime versus something that's compiled in. Zero copy features are important to allow you to reduce your memory overhead, right? If every time you have to pass your mesh, you have to copy the whole thing, then you're doubling your footprint, right? So there's aspects of zero copy that help out a lot there. And then blueprints how we pass meshes. So before we hop into the Python regime, I just want to go over this first light example. So the first light example is a toy that shows you how to make a picture with Ascent using, let's see. There's questions. Oh, look at this. So I will answer questions in just a second. I'm sorry. So I mean, actually, well, we can do this right now before we start into this. So the link to the AWS link was not set out yet, and I'm going to show you how to do that. You'll grab an instance on the fly. So how portable is the in situ configuration for other clusters? So I think so once you have built Ascent on your new cluster, right, and we have scripts that help with that, the prescription of the actions you want to do is it really only depends on the parameters of your simulation itself, right? It's definitely machine portable, right? If you want to make an ISO surface of something and you want to take and run that on another system, it should be the same prescription for making an ISO surface, right? So you can check in those things just like, you could think of them as little analysis scripts. Will it need to be, yeah, okay, so thanks, Nicole. And then let's see, Nicole did a good job. All right, so Nicole answered all these. I got scared when I was these. So yeah, so hooks for existing computation. So triggers basically allow you to invoke Ascent itself, but Ascent does have a way of registering callbacks that you can provide in your simulation too. So there's some aspects there. All right. Sorry, I panicked when I saw all the things in Nicole so thank you, Nicole. Any other questions before we dive into a code example here? We good? I can see. All right. Cool. Okay. So again, this is what we call the first slide example. So this is C++. Everything we do after this is going to be Python, but I hope to convince you that the C++ and the Python aren't horribly different, right? So the purpose of this is just to show you how to make a picture with Ascent with some example data. So in this particular example, let me get back on here. So in a real example, you would instrument your simulation code, right? And with Ascent, and for us, we're really just creating an example mesh. So Conduit comes with the set of example meshes, and the one we use here is called braid because it has this field that has this braid-like pattern. And basically, the helper function here populates that conduit node object, which is a tree that you're going to learn a lot about, with all the details of an unstructured mesh. So now we get into the Ascent API. So we create Ascent and we set it up. If we were running in a MPI context, there's a way we would hand an integer for the MPI handle here, or the MPI communicator handle here, but this is just a serial program. And then we hand our mesh to Ascent. So when Ascent gets this mesh, it's basically going to zero copy the whole thing. And it expects the memory to still be there while you're executing and stuff like that, but it has its own zero copy access to this mesh. Now we need to tell Ascent what to do. So this example shows you how to create one of these trees that is asking it to make a scene with a plot and render out to a file. The best way to think about this is in terms of the equivalent YAML, right? This hierarchical context here. And when we go through the examples, it'll make a little bit more sense why these things are kind of deeply nested. In particular, scenes, we have S1 here, which is our own name, but we can have 10 scenes if we wanted to, right? So there's a lot of flexibility and you could render multiple things at a time. So that's why this nested structure exists in the API. Then we execute, fantastic. So we pass that conduit node that has that hierarchical description to Ascent, and we get a picture, right? So that's where we're at. And this picture just has a default camera angle, and it shows you the braid pattern, and the rest of the time you get to learn about all the other fun things we can do, right? So when teaching people about Ascent, we like to talk about the top level things. You've already heard me kind of allude to these. But scenes are something that allows you to make pictures. So that's great. If you're going to have a scene with multiple plots in it, that allows you to render out PNGs, for example. Pipelines you can think of them as filter pipelines. They allow us to transform data if you're doing your clipping or things like that. You can build series of filters together. Extracts help you capture data. So primarily we use this to save to HDF5 files, and those HDF5 files kind of follow this blueprint structure, so you can get your mesh data back out even after you've sliced it or what have you. Queries allow you to ask questions, right? So if you want to know a maximum value or something like that. And then triggers kind of extend the concept of a query to allow you to direct actions, meaning if this, then that. So if this happens, then run this pipeline, right? Or if this happens, then save this extract. So these are the things that we're going to use together to make a whole bunch of visualizations. Okay, so for Livermore folks, or just a general notice here. So if you're behind a VPN or a firewall, it's possible that those things may block general access to the Amazon Web Service IP addresses and random ports, right? We're going to be handing you a random IP address with a random port that has a Jupyter notebook running on it. You each get your own. So if you can't connect to it, you may have to disconnect from VPN, or you might have to request a firewall exemption. So actually, Justin, can you put this? I think this is still the same EOR link. Can you put this in the chat in case anyone needs it? Yeah. So if you're at Livermore, there's a process you can do to get an exemption from the firewall. That's what this is, and it might take a few minutes to kick in. You can also run the Docker containers yourself. Of course, that's a little bit more complicated. But we're going to be showing you all these things through these Docker containers, and yeah, you'll be able to follow along. All right. Okay, so now it's time to get started with actually running the tests here, or sorry, the examples. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this guy here. So what I want you to do is you're going to go to Ascent-DAE tutorial, and you should see a page like this. And when you go here, you can click on, oh, this should say latest, by the way, not develop. You can click on this. Aha, so good. So a few people have already done it. So now if you click request server, you will grab one of those guys there. So feel free to do this. We'll wait a minute. And if anyone has any problems with this, let us know. So if you got one of them, you'll land in a page that looks exactly like this, right? So so the password is, okay, yeah. So the EOR link will is only necessary for people who are at Livermore because of our internal networks. But yeah, so yeah. So if you can't connect to a AWS thing based on like your own company network or something like that, it might be that yeah, you can run this guy here with Docker. Sorry. What I would recommend, there's a typo, so let me go back here. So this should really be, it should be latest instead of develop, and that will run for you. And this is what I just did after fumbling through it a little bit. And then once you run that, there's a web server running connected to localhost on port quadruple 8, so 8888. And you'll end up here on this guy. Yep, and the password's learn, L-E-A-R-N, and you hit that, and then you should land on a notebook just like this. And just to make it easier, I'm going to only share this. So let me go back to this. It might make it a little bit less cluttered if I only share the notebook. So let me get my chat up. Okay, so folks doing okay? Thumbs up if you. I don't know if we can see your thumbs up, but if you have any problems, ask, and we'll try to intervene here. Right. So many people are familiar with Jupyter notebooks, but just in case you aren't, so these are kind of interactive Python notebooks that we're going to be using. These are the list of the ones we're going to work through today. The first one is Ascent First Light, which is basically the Python example, basically the Python equivalent of the C++ example I just showed you in the PowerPoint. So we'll run this just to make sure that we can make some pictures and the setup. And then after that, we'll dive into some of the learning and the content. So here we go. So again, first slide example, we want to make some picture, right? In C++ land, we include the conduit headers. In Python land, we import the conduit modules and the set module, etc. So to run these notebook examples, you hit Shift Enter on these cells, and that as you execute those, it'll go to the next cell. So here we're going to create our example mesh. Again, Conduit has these built-in examples. We're using our lovely favorite braid. And we're going to run Ascent. So a couple different things here than in the other example. So whenever you open Ascent, you can give it some options. This would be, if we were running with MPI, this is where you would give it an MPI communicator as well. In this case, we're running in a notebook. So we'd like to forward anything that goes wrong to the notebook. By default, Ascent tries to capture all of its exceptions so it doesn't crash the simulation code. But simulation code can opt to forward those exceptions and catch them themselves and provide, whatever hooks they want for their users. But just we try to be nice by default. In this case, we want to see if something goes wrong, so we're saying let's forward any problems. Open our Ascent, publish our mesh, build our actions. Again, we're building a hierarchical tree here. So this is how we do it with the Python API, very similar to the C++ API. But effectively, we're doing these key values. Some of the terminal things are, well, in this case, they're all strings because these are just descriptions of what we want to do. And for all of our examples, we show you the YAML equivalent. That's kind of the better way to think about it, right? So we execute, great. This is the YAML equivalent of what we're trying to do built here. And then in the Jupyter environment, we have this nice little widget. So when you go in EOR, so Landon, when you go in EOR, you ask for an exemption, and you ask for an exemption for a set of time, and you say that you're taking a training class. So you submit one of those. Does that make sense? Yeah, and it might take a few minutes. So I guess we probably should have had folks sent this out to folks beforehand. I apologize for that. And then once you have that done, you want to end up back into this tutorial thing, and then you'll get your own server, right? So still plenty available, so you're good. So okay, so we made the same picture. We made the same picture here that we made with the C++, which is good. So all these examples also have exercises that you can kind of poke at on your own to explore a little bit longer. We want to try to get through the bulk of them with you guys, with you all of you today. So there might be some time later, but did I hear a question? Sorry, I thought I heard something. We're good. Okay. So we've accomplished the same thing in Python that we've accomplished in C++. And now we're going to kind of dive into some of the details of learning. And for that, we're going to hand it over to Justin, right? Do you want to do the conduit basics?
Yep, ready to rock. Okay, so as we talked about in Cyrus's intro, Ascent API is based on conduit. We pass both mesh data and action descriptions to Ascent as conduit trees. And what we were trying to convince you with the first slide example is that the C++ and Python interfaces are very similar. They are very similar. The C++ interface is very much inspired by or influenced by the Python interface and how easy it is to use. So the next few examples provide basic knowledge about creating conduit nodes to use with Ascent. There's a whole bunch more. If you're really excited about conduit and learning conduit, there's a bunch more stuff in conduit's tutorial documentation. So let's get started. Run the first few cells. Again, that's Shift Enter runs the cells. Please, there we go. So we need to import conduit and import NumPy. We'll see why we use NumPy in a second. So like we talked about in the introduction, the core of Conduit's data model is this node object that holds dynamic hierarchical key value trees. This simple example just makes a single key value pair. We create a node, we assign the string value to the name key. And so then we print it out in the YAML representation, and it looks like that. Then if we start adding slashes in to the names, then that imposes a tree structure. So this kind of what you would expect. dir1 slash dir2 slash val1 means that val1 is this leaf that has this value 100.5, and it's a child of a node called dir2, which is a child of a node called dir1. So let's see. The leaf nodes at the bottom of trees can have strings, or they can have bit-width style numeric arrays. In C++, you can pass raw pointers, or you can pass std vectors with numeric values. In Python, we use NumPy and D arrays. So this is an example where we create the first 10 values of the Fibonacci sequence, and I added an extra print here just to show there's a difference. You can print to YAML, and you can also just print a node to get an overview. But this is what this looks like. So we create our array, we add the Fibonacci, we put all the Fibonacci numbers in, and then the YAML representation gives us everything, or we can just ask for an overview with print. So that's what that looks like. Conduit also supports zero copy, like we discussed in the introduction. So you don't have to, well, I'll show you how zero copy works here in a second. So there's two different ways of setting data into a node. You can use set, and you can use a method called set external that does zero copying. So here we do the same thing where we create two different arrays, and we put first 10 Fibonacci numbers into both of them. But then when we load stuff into our node, we put, see, for one of the arrays we deep copy into our node, and then the other array we shallow copy. And then you will see we're going to change the last element of each array to be -1. And then we should see that for the deep copied array, nothing happened because we have our own copy of it. But for the shallow copied array, we just have a view of the array that owns it. So we're going to see that the last element has changed. So this is what we expect to see, right? The last element of the shallow copied array changed because we don't own that data. Then I think we're skipping the exercises. So we're going to move on to the third notebook, which is the conduit blueprint, conduit mesh blueprint examples. So as we discussed before, simulation mesh data is passed to Ascent using a shared set of conventions called the mesh blueprint. And you can read more about that there in the conduit documentation website. Basically, if everybody agrees on a set of shared conventions for what qualifies as a simulation mesh, then everybody can understand meshes the same way and use meshes. So we have these conventions that we provide, and then there's these runtime checks and we'll show you what that looks like, where you can say, does this data conform to the mesh blueprint? And we support a wide range of different simulation mesh types with Conduit Blueprint. We'll see a couple of those here. And then it's easy to adapt existing data to conform to the mesh blueprint because of the zero copy support that we saw on the last notebook. So let's see. There's more examples of mesh blueprint on the Conduit documentation also. So we'll grab a bunch of imports, and then our very first example is creating a uniform grid with a single field. So this looks like a lot of stuff here. I think the easiest way to understand this is to look at the YAML representation of the mesh that we're creating. But really quickly, we create a mesh, we add a coordinate set to it, we set up all the different things that mesh blueprint needs to have for a coordinate set to be a valid coordinate set. We create a topology, and then we create fields. I'll talk through each of those things again once we see the representative YAML. So this is the YAML representation of the mesh that we created. It's easier to see the hierarchical structure versus looking at this with all the slashes in the names. But these are the different pieces that you need to have in a blueprint mesh. So let's see, we have one coordinate set called chords. It is a uniform coordinate set. And then it has dims, it's 9 by 9 by 9. And you can see we set that up here. IJK 999, and then we gave it an origin of -10, -10, -10. And we also set that up here. And adding an origin and spacing to a coordinate set is optional. We're just showing the different things that you can do. And then we have spacing of 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. So we've created an implicit coordinate set with these parameters, basically, where it's going to start at -10, -10, -10. It's going to extend. It's going to be 9 points in each direction, and the distance between each of those points is going to be 2.5. Then we have one topology called topo. Topo is also a uniform topology, and it references the coordinate set chords. And chords has enough. There's enough information there that we don't need to specify anything else with the topology. We'll see a more complicated topology in the next example. Then there, I guess I'll show you where we set up the topology. Very simple, right? The case is simple because it's implicitly derived from the coordinate set, and then we have to reference the name of the coordinate set. Then the field, we have a single field called alternating. It is a vertex associated field, so that means that there's a single value for each vertex, vertex in our mesh. And then we have to reference a field that lives on top of a topology lives on top of a coordinate set. So we have to reference a topology, referencing our topology topo. And then we have all these values. There's a whole lot of them. There should be 9 by 9 by 9. And the field that we created, we called it alternating. It's just 1 0 1 0 1 0 for each of the points. And so you can see it created that pretty simply here. And then we use set external so that we zero copied our field data in. So that's the mesh that we created. And then there's this method. We have conduit blueprint mesh verify. We can pass a mesh and then an info node. And we can ask does this mesh that we created, does this data that we created conform to the mesh blueprint? Is this valid? Can all of our tools that understand the mesh blueprint understand this as a mesh? That's what that does. And so we run that, you can see mesh verify success, so we're good. If we did not succeed, then we can get a very detailed bunch of information from verify info, showing us exactly where in the tree things kind of went off the rails. So now the Ascent setup should be pretty standard by now, pretty familiar by now. We publish the mesh to Ascent. We have simple actions where we make a pseudo color plot of the alternating field. And then we give a name to the output file that we want. Printing the actions makes things a little simpler than looking at the code. You see the representative YAML. So there's the actions, right? We make a pseudo color plot of the alternating field. And then we can look at our render, and unsurprisingly, it's alternating. We have this nice stripe pattern. So that's example number 1. I don't see any questions in the chat.
No, we're good. We're good. Someone was coming in late. Hopefully, George, you're able to get up and running. If not, let us know.
Okay. Then I'll keep going with the second example, which is creating an unstructured tetrahedral mesh with a couple fields on it. So again, it's easier to understand this in the context of looking at the YAML that it creates. So I'm going to go ahead and run all this, and we'll jump back up there once we create the YAML. So this is a different kind of mesh. It's unstructured. Instead of an implicit coordinate set with a bunch of parameters that describe it, we have an explicit coordinate set with 5 points in it. And so we have the coordinate set's called chords. We say it's an explicit coordinate set. And then X, Y, and Z are each these arrays with 5 elements in them. And each column describes a point, right? So the first point is -1, 0, 0. The next one is 0, -1, etc. And so the way we created that is we have an explicit NumPy array that we create, and then we use set external to zero copy those into our mesh. Next up is our topology. Our topology is a lot more interesting than last time. So we say the topology is called mesh, and then we have the type is an unstructured topology, which has these extra things that are required. So we have to say it references this coordinate set, and then the coordinate set's called chords that we set up. And then for an unstructured topology, we need to have this child called elements. Elements is going to have a shape and a connectivity. There's other things it can have as well, but shape and connectivity. So in this case, we say that the shape is tet, which is short for tetrahedrons. And then, so a tetrahedron has 4 points. So then this implicitly means that for our connectivity array, that every 4 points is another tetrahedron. So In this case, these values in the connectivity array are indices into the coordinate set. So our first tetrahedron uses points 0, 1, 3, and 2. So that would be 0, right? The very first one, 1, and then 3 is this point, and then 2 is this point. And then our second tetrahedron uses points 4, 3, 1, and 2. So 4 is the last one, and 3, 1, and 2. So it looks like our two tets, they share 3 of the 4 points, and then they each have their own special unique point. And then let's see, to set up the topology, as you might expect, we say it's unstructured, we give it the coordinate set, and then to make the connectivity, we code that up ourselves, explicitly enumerated all these values. And then for the fields are both really simple, var1 and var2. They're both element associated fields. I think in example one, it was a vertex associated field. For an element associated field, we have one value per element as opposed to one value per point in the mesh, one value per vertex. We both of these fields reference the mesh topology, and then var1 has 0, 1, so the first tet has 0, the second tet has 1, and then for var2 it's the opposite. You see, it's pretty simple. Up here we create those two arrays, and then we give them their values explicitly, and then we use set external to 0, copy them into our mesh. So this is what our basic unstructured tetrahedral mesh looks like. We'll go ahead and call conduit blueprint mesh verify to make sure that it is in fact a valid blueprint mesh. Mesh verify was successful, so now we can go ahead and look at it with Ascent. This is kind of the boilerplate that we've seen before. We're going to make a pseudo-color plot of var1, and let's take a look. So yes, and here's our actions. Again, we're making a pseudo-color plot of var1. And so this is what we'd expect to see. I think this was even in one of the slides that we saw earlier. There's two tetrahedrons, and they share 3 points, and then they each have their own unique point. And then one of them has a field value of 0, the other has a field value of 1, which is what we set up in our tree for var1. So that is our second example. I think there's one more example for Mesh Blueprint, and then I'll hand this off to someone else. I don't know if it's Nicole or Cyrus. So Mesh Blueprint or Conduit Blueprint provides a whole menu of mesh examples that are built in that you can quickly generate on the fly to cover the range of different kinds of coordinate sets, topologies, fields, all the different kinds of things that you can describe with Conduit Blueprint. We have examples that you can quickly make that demonstrate those capabilities. So in this example, we're going to be using this braid example, which I think we showed in the first flight Jupyter Notebook. And then we're going to modify one of its fields to create this time varying thing. And then we're going to make a loop and render it for each time step and create a little movie, basically. So this is a function that takes a field from the braid mesh, and then it makes some modifications for it to make it interesting. I don't know if when Cyrus goes over this stuff, if he talks about all the stuff that's happening here. I'm just going to skip ahead. And we'll just see it. All we need to know is that it modifies the field in an interesting way based on the interp argument. So let's see. This is how we create one of the mesh examples. There's this conduit blueprint mesh examples call, and then there's a whole bunch of examples there, and you can, in this case, we're calling braid. And each of the most of the mesh examples have documentation that you can read about and see pictures of them. But in this case, we're asking for braid. Braid says, oh, well, what kind of mesh do you want? And in this case, we're saying, I want a hexahedral mesh. And then I want it to be 50 by 50 by 50 in the X, Y, and Z, and then put the result into this conduit node called mesh. So go ahead and run that. In fact, I think it might be illuminating to see what mesh looks like. So we'll just print an overview and rerun. This is what braid looks like in its YAML form. Right, the coordinate sets we have an explicit coordinate set like we saw before. There's an unstructured topology. Instead of tetrahedral elements, now they're hexahedral elements. So every 6 elements in it are going to be every 6 elements in this array are going to make up an element of our mesh, a hexahedral element of our mesh. I didn't print the full YAML. I just did print to get an overview because there's a lot of stuff in here, and that would be a gigantic output in the Jupyter notebook. We'd be scrolling through it for the next hour probably. Then there's a few different fields on it. One called braid, that's vertex associated, right? So that means that there's a value for every vertex in our mesh. There's a radial field that's element associated, so that means there's a value for every element in our mesh. And then vel or velocity is a vertex associated vector field. So there's actually 3 values for each point in the mesh. And then there's this extra node up here, state, we have where we can put time and cycle for our mesh. And so we're going to be modifying the cycle for each time step as we're going to be modifying one of the fields as well for each time step. And then we can make an interesting series of images. So I'll show you that next. So we have the same kind of boilerplate setup for getting Ascent going, but then instead of making one render, we're going to make this loop. Each iteration of the loop is going to call this braid time varying function that we saw up above, which is going to modify the braid field in an interesting way. And then we're also going to change the cycle of our simulation, of our mesh, so that way we get a different picture for each of the cycles, I think. And then we publish the mesh each time to Ascent, and then we execute and move through the loop. So when I run this, I think we should start seeing, let's see, we'll get the actions out, and then we'll see that the value that we're using to seed the field changes is changing. I think it goes from 0 to 1 over the course of 20 steps. So we'll let that finish. All right, and then at this point, we should be able to render all of the results and watch as though it was a movie. So I'll go ahead and click play. So now you've seen how you can create meshes with in-memory data, and you can also quickly generate mesh examples from the mesh blueprint library to do some interesting things from the blueprint mesh examples namespace in C++. And then we can look at things and how they change over time, and we can create a whole bunch of renders to make a movie. And I think we're skipping the exercises, so that's all from me.
Okay, so I'll be talking about scenes. So scenes are how we make pictures in Ascent. A scene will describe everything you want to encapsulate when you do your rendering, and then you can use your scene to generate one or more images. They can either render the mesh that you've directly published to Ascent, or you can use the results of an Ascent pipeline, which we'll learn about next. So here we'll just make some pictures that are directly published to Ascent of the mesh that's directly published to Ascent. So we'll load our import libraries. The mesh we're going to use is just going to be that really basic example, which we can print it out, of that tet mesh. And we see, Justin just explained how the coordinate sets and topologies work. If we look down here, we have 2 fields, var1, var2. And if we look at their values, there's only 2 values, and it looks like they mirror each other. So our first example is we're going to use multiple scenes to render both of these variables. So we have 2 variables. We want to make 2 pictures to look at both of them. So we instantiate Ascent. We open Ascent. We're not giving any options. This is where we would do that. Say forwarding exceptions, or we also have timers. So you can add some timers to what Ascent is executing. We have our mesh example, so we'll publish that to Ascent. And then from there, we'll add our scenes. So if we wanted to change our data, we'd add pipelines, but we don't know about pipelines yet. So we'll just go ahead and render what we published to Ascent. So the first thing we need to do is we need to declare our action. So we're declaring our action as we're adding scenes. And then from there, we define our scenes. So scenes is a key word, but from there, S1 and S2, defining our two different scenes. Those are arbitrary. We could have maybe been a little more creative with our naming. But it makes the point for us. So we have S1 is our first scene. So we need to find the plot that we want to render. The type of plot we want to do is going to be a pseudo-color plot, and we want to render var1. And then we need to give this image an image name. So we just say out scene example1 render var1. Then for scene 2, we're going to define our S2. We're going to define what we want to render as our plot type, which is going to be a pseudo-color rendering of var2. And again, we then give it a unique name. So pretty similar, but we're going to name this with var2. So we can render that and go ahead and look at our Ascent action tree. So we see, our nice hierarchical structure. We have our add scenes, then we have our scenes declaration, and then within there we have our two scenes. So S1 rendering var1 and S2 rendering var2. Then we can look at what we generated. So if we look up above our color map, we have our field name. So this is an image of var1. We'll just toggle, and there's our var2. So they're mirror images of each other. Cool. Go ahead and close that out. So what we just did is we used two scenes to render one plot each, but let's go ahead and render one scene, so generate one image, but let's add multiple plots to that single image. So again, we'll instantiate Ascent, we'll open it, we'll publish the mesh. From here, we're going to add our scenes again as our action. And we're only going to have one scene, so just a single S1. But under that, we defined plots before. And initially, we just had a P1. But now that we're going to have a second plot, we're going to end up defining a P2. So our first plot is going to be at pseudo-color rendering of var1. And then another type of render we can do is a mesh plot. So we can do a mesh rendering over the pseudo-color rendering. So we can get the lines of our mesh atop our scalar data. And since we're only rendering one scene, we're only going to have one image name. Go ahead and execute this, and we can look at our action tree. So we have our add scenes. Under scenes, we have our single scene S1. But under our plots for this scene, we have two plots. We have the pseudo-color rendering of var1 and then the mesh rendering. So we can go ahead and see what that looks like. So again, no surprise of what var1 is going to look like, but now we have this white outline that represents that mesh rendering. Great. So another thing in scenes is you can adjust all of those camera parameters. So the renderings we just made was using the default camera that you can just use. It puts the bounds in frame. It points down the z-axis and then points towards the center of your data set. But say we want to change our parameters, right? It's a 3D data set. We're pointing right down the z-axis. It makes it look like a 2D data set. So let's go ahead and change some of our camera parameters. So cameras live under what we call renders. So when you make a scene, you set up the type of rendering you want to do and the field variable you want to render, but then you can define different renders and you can generate multiple pictures based off that single scene declaration. So here we have the scene we want to render. So we're just going to have an S1. It's going to have a single plot. It's going to be a pseudo-color rendering of var1. But now we can define multiple renders and generate two different images of different camera angles for this var1 pseudo-color rendering. So for our scene, we're going to define our first render, R1. We're going to give it its own image name, and then we're going to change the azimuth of our camera. We're going to rotate it 10 degrees. And then for R2, instead, we're going to zoom in from that default camera. Both of these are acting off the default camera. So render R1 will rotate the default camera 10 degrees. And then render R2 will zoom in the camera by 3. So we can see our action tree, what that looks like. So here we have our add scenes. We have a single scene that we've defined, but under our scenes, we're going to be making two images. So we have renders R1 and R2. We can go ahead and see what that looks like. So here is our azimuth rotation. So we can now get a better view of what this 3D data set looks like. And then the second image is just that zoomed in data set. So based on that default camera, we're back to pointing down the z-axis, but now a closer viewpoint. Okay, so another thing we can do is we can change color tables. So instantiate Ascent, we'll open it, we'll publish our mesh. Again, our actions, we're just living in this add scenes world. So within our scene, we can change the color table, which lives under our plot world. So we'll make two scenes here with two different color tables of the same variable. For our first scene, we'll just do a pseudo color rendering of var1. And for this, we'll change the color table to Viridis. And we'll say the image name, respectively, also has to do with Viridis. So then for our second image, our scene 2, we're going to then change our plot color table again, and this time we'll use Inferno. And there is a list of color tables that are available within Ascent. And then we also give it its own image name. So we can look at our actions tree. Great, so we have our add scenes, and under scenes we have our two different scenes, S1 and S2, where we're going to be doing a pseudo color rendering of the same variable var1, but here under our plots we're going to be changing our color tables. So they should end up looking different. So here is our Viridis. So we have our path name. We know that this is the Viridis one. And then we can toggle and get Inferno. So maybe for this, maybe Inferno, we have the option of changing background color. So we could probably change the background to white would probably be a more ideal background for that color table. Okay, so that leads to our exercises. So that's all for scenes. So for all of those examples, we were rendering data that was directly published to Ascent, but now we're going to learn about pipelines. So pipelines can be used to compose filters. This is where you can transform your data into new meshes that can then be rendered in scenes. So this will be your typical geometric transformations or your field-based transformations. And then these results can be used in either scenes, which we just learned about, or extracts, which we'll learn about next. Go ahead and load all of our import libraries. So we're going to move on from that very basic TET example to now the built-in braid example that Justin used. Instead of 50 cubed, we'll do 25 cubed across our dimensions. So the first example we're going to do is we're going to be rendering a contour of this mesh. So we open instantiate and then open Ascent. We publish this braid mesh example. But now we need to transform our data, and to do that, we need to add pipelines. So that will be our action. Pipelines is the keyword. So under our pipelines, we will then define however many pipelines you want. You can have multiple pipelines. So here we'll just do a single pipeline, PL1. We'll add a single filter to it, F1, and that has a keyword type. And that filter that we're going to choose is contour. So contour represents one of the many actions that Ascent has available to you. There will be parameters associated with all of the actions, and we have a list that shows what parameters are required and any associated default values. But if you're missing a required parameter, we should hopefully have well enough error and error messages that are clear enough that you know what you're missing and you'll know what you need to fix. So we're adding a filter to our pipeline. This filter is the contour filter that has some specific parameters it needs. So it needs to know what field it is going to be contouring over. So we give it the field braid. And then for this specific contour, we're going to be contouring over two ISO values, 0.2 and 0.4. This is, a priori knowledge that we know about braid. We know it has these values. But if you're exploring your data, you might not know those values. So instead of declaring specific ISO values, you can declare levels and declare an integer of number of levels you would like to see contoured, and it'll equally space ISO values across your min and max values. So then after we've applied our filter, we want to look at what we've transformed our data into. So we can add our scenes, which we know how to do now. So we're just going to make one image. We'll have an S1. We want to add our plot. We're going to do a pseudo color rendering of that field braid that we just contoured. But the important part is we are adding scenes. We need to attach it to the pipeline we just built, right? We need to attach our pipes to make sure our mesh flows through. If we weren't to do this, then our scene would be acting directly on the mesh that we just published. And so when I go to render this image, it'll look similar to what Justin showed, right? There is no pipeline. This is just the basic mesh that is being printed out to Ascent or published to Ascent. So let me go ahead and attach this pipeline back to our scene. So it's going to be rendering out the output of this contour filter. Go ahead and execute that. We can look at our actions tree. So here before our scene declaration, we have our pipeline declaration where we have a PL1. It has a single filter of type contour, which has associated parameters. And then from there, we're adding our scenes, a single scene with a single plot that is most importantly attached to pipeline PL1. So then let's go ahead and see what this contour did. Ah, look at that. So, right, and we only have 2 images. We only had 2 ISO values. This makes sense. So we're getting this kind of fun contour honeycomb shape. Okay, so now for our next example, let's combine 2 filters into a single pipeline. So we will instantiate Ascent, we will publish that braid mesh again to Ascent. And then the next thing we need to do to transform our data is add pipelines. So for our first pipeline, let's perform a threshold filter. So we're only going to be making 1 pipeline. So for this whole example, we'll just be dealing in PL1, but we're going to have multiple filters. So under PL1, our first filter, F1, will be a threshold. Threshold has certain parameters it requires, so it needs a field. So we're going to give it that field braid again. And then again, kind of some a priori knowledge we already know about braid. We know some values about it, so we know what to set these threshold values to, a min and max value. Our second filter, F2, will be of type clip. We have several different options of types of clips. There's planes, boxes. I think I'm missing some. Here we're going to do a spherical clip. So for these parameters, it'll need a center and a radius. And then from there, so that's just F2, our second filter, and it's attached to PL1. So first our data flows through our threshold and then flows through our clip filter. Then to render our data, we can add our scenes. We'll do a pseudo color rendering of braid, which just flew through 2 different filters, but both of those filters come from our pipeline PL1. We'll give it an image name, go ahead and execute. Look at our actions tree. So here we have our pipelines. We have a single pipeline PL1, but here we have our 2 filters, threshold and clip. And then we have our scene where we are attaching the pipeline. So now we can see what we've got. So it looks like, yeah, we've got some fun cubism coming from our thresholding. And then we see the sphere clipped out of our data coming from F2. Okay, so now we're going to combine everything. We've made multiple pipelines with individual filters. Nope, we haven't done that. That's what we're about to do. We're going to create multiple pipelines. One will have a single filter and another pipeline will have multiple filters. So what we're going to basically be doing is combining example 1 with example 2. So we instantiate Ascent, we open Ascent, we'll publish our braid mesh. Let's add our first pipeline. So that'll be a PF1. Our first and only filter for PL1 will be of type contour. We'll do it over braid again, and we'll use those same 2 ISO values. We will add a second pipeline now, which will have 2 filters, and that again will be our threshold and clip filters. So now we're in PL2, our F1 is threshold, and then PL2, our F2 is clip, again with those same parameters as we had before. So now we can add our scenes. So now, what do we want to do? We want to render these 2 pipelines in a single scene. How do we do that? Well, we know we can do a single scene and add multiple plots. So that's what we're going to do. We have a single scene S1, and under our plots, we're going to have a P1, which attaches to our first pipeline PL1. It's going to do a pseudo color rendering of that field braid. And then we'll have a second plot that attaches to our second pipeline PL2, also doing a pseudo color rendering of the field braid. Go ahead and look at our actions tree. Here's our pipelines, PL1 with a single filter, PL2 with 2 filters, a single scene under our add scenes, but with 2 plots and our single image name. And most importantly, the plots attaching to our 2 pipelines. We'll go ahead and render, and we're getting the combination of our 2 examples, the ISO the contour ISO values honeycomb with our cubist sphere artwork. Cool. So that leads us to our exercises, which will lead for all of you to do on your own. I'm then going to move on to extracts, which I've briefly mentioned, but extracts are how you can capture your data and then process your data outside of Ascent's pipeline infrastructure. So this can include saving mesh data to HDF5 files on disk. You can create Cinema databases. So Cinema was a project, I believe, was it San Diego or Lano? I don't remember. But basically, how they attacked the a priori in situ problem is rather than figuring out a good viewpoint, let's just give you a bunch of viewpoints. Let's render a bunch of images. 100 images is going to be less than saving out a full time slice. So you can create a Cinema database where you've rendered your data from a bunch of different angles and it get put into a folder. You can also run custom Python analysis scripts. So I'll show you a number of different examples. Most of them will be HDF5. We'll go ahead and load our import libraries. We'll use our braid mesh again as our example. So the first example is going to do just straight out HDF5 files. It'll be a blueprint flavor because we're going to be using a conduit IO library called Relay. So you're going to get the conduit blueprint flavored HDF5 files. So we instantiate Ascent, we open, we're going to publish our mesh. We're not going to transform it or add any pipelines. Let's just save out our data. We want it out of the simulation. So we're just going to add our extracts. That's going to be our action. Under our extracts, we're going to have just a single one. We're just going to declare one type of extract to save out one output file. Per time step, it'll just be one because we're only doing a single time step. But so the type will be the type relay. So this is that conduit IO library. For the params, we need a path name. So we'll give it our output path that we'd like to be named it. And then the protocol associated with this conduit relay IO library that we would like outputted is this blueprint mesh HDF5. So we can go ahead and execute and look at our YAML actions tree. So here we have our actions. We're adding our extracts, single extract of E1 type relay with the parameters needed. So we end up saving out a file called, what associated with our path with some extra metadata. So it's given the cycle number and then the .root extension. So then we can, see that this file exists. Awesome, it does. It's probably over here somewhere out for all fields. Wonderful. Cycle underscore 100 root. So we saw that it got generated. You could open this up and visit. And then you can, render the field braid and then be able to move it around with your mouse and visit and see different angles. And then compare it with Ascent or do whatever you want. I don't know. Okay, so our second example is going to be saving our input mesh, but instead of saving the entire mesh that's public to Ascent, we want to limit it to a selected field. And again, we're going to save it to an HDF5 file. We open Ascent, we publish our mesh. We're only going to be doing a single extract, but our action is adding extract. Type E1, we're still going to be doing this conduit flavor mesh HDF5 file. Still give it an output path. But now we can give it this optional parameter of fields and where it expects a list of field names that you would like to save out. And we're only going to save out braid. So that means we're going to be ditching radial and vel that we know is also part of this example mesh. So we can go ahead and execute. Here's the output name. So this one's now just named one fields. We can ls to make sure it exists. Wonderful. And then again, we could open this up and visit. And I can look to the left and I can see, yeah, here's all fields. And then one field was also generated. Okay, so our next example, the previous two, we published directly from the we saved directly from the published mesh. And now we are going to add a contour filter and save out the results of a pipeline to our HDF5 files. Instantiate Ascent, open Ascent, publish our mesh. And now we know how to add pipelines. So we're going to add that contour filter. It'll be a single pipeline with a single filter. So PL1, F1 of type contour, the associated parameters necessary. So we defined the field that we want to contour over along with the ISO values. Then we add our extract. And much like our scenes, when we wanted to visualize the output of our pipeline, the most important part is attaching that pipeline to our extract. So if we were to miss this line, we would just be directly saving out the data that's been published to our mesh. So without this, we will not get that contoured mesh that we were hoping for. Go ahead and execute so we can see our contour. That's fun that it did this. Okay. Saw that it was generated. Yes, and now I see 3 root files. Wonderful. And a braid contour.cycle. Again, you could look at this in Visit. Our next example is we're going to be doing a cinema database. So this is where you kind of just overflow with renders to look at your data if you don't know what you want to look at yet. So let's go ahead and add a pipeline. Maybe you're adding a contour filter and you don't know how this is going to change your data and you'd like to look at it from a bunch of different angles. So making a cinema database is a great option for that. So we'll add a pipeline. We'll just do our contour filter for PL1, F1. And then cinema, rather than living in extracts, actually lives in our scene world. So we'll be doing pseudo color type renderers. We tell it the field we want to render. We tell it the pipeline because we want to make sure we're rendering out the contour version of this field. But then under renders, which previously we used to change the camera angles, right? We used it for the azimuth and the zoom. So to get different renders of the same scene, that's why cinema is here rather than an extract, right? We're generating multiple images from a single scene. So the renders type here, we can declare as cinema. And then a couple of parameters cinema needs is it needs phi and theta. So you'll end up with 25 images where it'll do the cross product of phi and theta equally dispersed around the data set. Then we need to give it a database name. And that's where all of our output will be saved. So here we have a little viewer code to help us see what we've generated. Where did it go? Oh, I closed it too fast. Oh, there we go. So here's our pipelines. So we're adding our contour pipeline, PLF1, and then we have our scenes where we set up our scene and then we define our renders, which will output our cinema database. And then we can look through this. So that little code help us render or visualize the data. So here's the path name we end up getting for our cinema database. We can rotate through. So so if you didn't know what you wanted to look at, this is a good option of just kind of getting an angle of everything. Oh, this is what this did. This does this fun, Gidget view or GUI view, widget GUI, yes. This thing. Single time step, so this won't do anything. But we can make it bigger. Hey. Cool. Okay, so the last example for extract is going to be a Python inception. It's Ouroboros Python. So I'm going to show you a Python example and run it in just our Jupyter Notebook Python interpreter. And then I'm going to use this Jupyter Notebook Python interpreter to run Ascent to then run Python. Okay, so what we're going to do is here's just a simple histogram calculation written in Python. So we're still using our mesh example. We're going to grab all of our braid values from our fields. We can get our min and our max values. We can compute the number of bins based on our extents, and then we can bin all of our values and get our histogram. And then we can print all of that information out. So here's the extents, here's our bin counts, and then our bin edges. And then it also, I know we saved it out. Yeah, we also saved it out to a YAML file. We can check that we made that and cat it out, and it's all there. Wonderful. And we're just going to be keeping that file to compare with when we do this exact same thing, but using Ascent. So here's that code we just wrote. So that code actually lives here somewhere already. Here it is. So we have this code already living in this file.py. So what we can do is we can call Ascent, and in our extracts, our type can be Python. And what we do is we point it towards that Python file. So now when our mesh is published, we have this extract, we can do our custom analysis via this Python file. So we can go ahead and execute. This generated, no, this did not generate. This used Python and it used this Python file. But it did generate because that file in this code said generate something as a YAML. It said outpy hist results.yaml. Wonderful. Does exist like that. So now here's just some code to make sure our results match, and they do. We did it. The snake ate itself. And that leads to some exercises, which we'll leave for you guys. And I'm going to pass it off back to Cyrus for queries.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so I mentioned, the Python and Python thing is a little bit brain melting, but the reason why that's there is if you do not have a Python interpreter in your simulation code, Ascent can provide one for you, and you can have, everyone knows you can have a lot of fun in Python. So Ascent is a way for you to have custom Python more easily deployed in your code. So we have a couple more notebooks to get through. These are going to talk about triggers and binning, and then also some formatting stuff. So let me get back to share here. Before I show you the notebooks, I just wanted to show you something sort of interesting. So Nicole was running a bunch of different examples for you, and this is kind of under the hood, but the way Ascent implements all these wonderful actions is through a data flow network. And we can look at how those networks execute with a visualization, and there's a way to save this out from Ascent. But I just wanted to show kind of how underneath the hood Ascent thinks about doing things. So this was the example where Nicole created multiple pipelines. So the first pipeline having a basically having one filter, and then with the contour, and then also the second pipeline having a threshold and a clip. And this is the graph that Ascent used to implement all these things. So as you enter all these things in, it uses unique names, and it builds all these things up, and it tracks the results in between all the things. So I don't know, it's a little bit of little bit of what's under the hood in case you're interested. So the final set of examples we're going to look at were related to queries, triggers, and binning. I'm also going to show you a path formatting example, which is a new one we got. So for queries, so queries are kind of a way of asking questions. So you've changed your data, you've saved your data out, you've rendered your data. Queries allow you to kind of ask concise summarization operations, right? So in this particular example, we'll show you how to define these, and then queries build into triggers that whole, if this wonderful thing happens, I'd like to use Ascent to do something. So in this example, we're importing a bunch of different things. We're going to actually use matplotlib to plot some of the results since they're curves. And we're using the Geyer example, which I think you'll see a picture of, but it's basically a vortex. All right, so what are we doing here? So in the style of Ascent, you have an action, you add something. In this case, we're adding queries, and then we're going to have a set of named queries. The query expressions that we have here are kind of a little domain-specific language that Ascent implements itself, right? So there's certain functions built in to do this. In this case, we're doing a very simple query. That's the cycle. So this will return the cycle that is basically published. So simulation codes obviously publish the counter of their physics cycle, right? And that's what this is. So if published through Ascent, then Ascent can query this. And this is a little bit more of a complicated expression here. So we're taking a histogram of a field, kind of like what Nicole did in Python, and we're taking the entropy of that histogram. And from that, we will eventually do more fun things. But this entropy is expected to change over time as this vortex evolves. Since you've never seen Geyer before, we're going to plot a picture of it. That's what you'll see here. but let's go ahead and execute this guy. So here's our overall actions, right? We have 2 queries and we're also adding a scene so you can see what's going on. And then when we execute, every time we execute this, it's a time varying data set. We're going to get this histogram out, and this histogram has basically some attributes and things that help describe it as a basically a set of, the number of bins, the different values that were used to set the range, etc. So we can plot that. Let's see, here's basically it's also stored in this YAML format, right? So this is the entropy of the result of the histogram, right? And if we look at this guy here, this is what this vortex thing looks like. It's actually called double gyre. There's two vortices and they move back and forth. This is a data set that people use for particle convection. So that's what we have there. And looking over time, so one of the things that we're doing here that's a little bit different than we've done before is we actually are using the output. We're using the output of Ascent info. So Ascent info gives you a whole bunch of information about what happened the last time you ran Ascent. And in that information are the result of all these queries and expressions, right? So for us, we can grab that and it has the time history, and then we can make a plot here. Right. So in this case, the entropy starts here, it pops right up, and then it just kind of levels off. It's, physically perhaps meaningful, but I mean, this is all a toy data set, right? So you can create more complicated expressions with those queries and ask more complicated things. But what I want to cover is the fact that you can feed this into what are called triggers, right? So a trigger is an if this, then do something, right? And that something can be anything that we've already taught you with Ascent. So you can set a condition, if something exciting happens, I'd like to make a picture. Or if something exciting happens, I'd like to save HDF5 files. Or if something exciting happens, I'd like to run a pipeline to calculate contours and make pictures and make sense of the databases, whatever you'd like to, right? So in this example, we're going to look at that entropy query that we did inside the query example, and we're going to build a condition around that. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, we have this style of actions, add queries. The new thing here is we're going to add a trigger. And in this case, we're adding 2 triggers. One of them has a condition that should fire if cycle equals 500, and then we give it a set of actions. So these actions, I think they just make pictures. We could look at them. Yeah, we can look at them real quick. So yeah, so that action just makes a picture, and the other action just makes a picture. The difference is that we have different names, so we can see, we can differentiate between which trigger fired, right? And then here's an example here where we're looking at the entropy, so the current entropy, and we're using this history function to access the past, and we can ask for entropy right before us. So that's what this does. And if that jumps greater than 0.5, then we want to trigger some set of Ascent actions, right? And those Ascent actions will make a picture. So let's go ahead and run this. Get the histograms out. And when we look at the cycle trigger, so again, it was going to render an image at cycle equals 500. That's good. So we only have one file outputted, and that file appears to be at cycle 500. So that was a success there, right? Oops. Let's see. Oh, I don't know what I did wrong. We changed okay. So we changed the name slightly. That's okay. So there we go. Fix that. There we go. And now the entropy trigger, so we had this chart here, right? And there's only really one case where we have a huge entropy jump, an entropy jump bigger than half, and that's at cycle 200. So we expect cycle 200 to be where this happens, right? So let me change this. We look fantastic. We got cycle 200, and this is the picture that we get out. So you can look at the full history of the expressions too through the Ascent info, like I said. So again, the idea here is you may not know exactly when something's going to happen, but you would know some, you don't know what time or you don't know what cycle, but you maybe can prescribe something like something's peak pressure. I want to see what happens during peak pressure, right? I'd like to make pictures then because maybe that's what's interesting happening in my simulation. So in those cases, you can do this prescription and it helps you be able to have flexibility, even though you're not there, human in the loop, making choices. Last set of examples are binning examples. So data binning you can think of as a multidimensional histogram. It's a pretty cheap method for reducing data and thinking about data. So we show examples of these. The data binning docs does a good job of describing, some of the gotchas and some of the use cases. But it's a very coarse thing. You set multidimensional bins, you set ranges, and then you walk your mesh. And as you walk your mesh, you accumulate things into these bins, and then you reduce them. So you can do things like mass distributions. You can do things like spatial distributions if you get creative. So these examples show you spatial distributions using binning. So I'll show you a couple of those. These are actually done through the query interface. You can do these as a filter as well, although we don't show that. But this shows you through the query interface. You can basically bin based on different spatial axes. And in this case, yeah. So in this case, like when you go up to all the way prescribing 3 axes on a 3D data, it kind of works like a line out. And when you do, when you prescribe 1 axis, then you have 1 set of bins that collapses all the way down to 1D. And then when you have 2 axes that collapses down to 2D, right? So here's an example of the queries that we're adding. So we have queries, our different 1D, 2D, 3D binnings. And here's all the results that we get. So we get a whole bunch of bins, with a whole bunch of values as you would expect. We'll go ahead and plot those. They're just simple, 1D, 2D arrays. So here's the binning of radial. This makes sense. Radial itself is something that varies based on a position. It's kind of just a radially changing field that expands out based on distance to position from 0. So that looks good. It's a little bit notchy because of our discretization, because we aren't perfect. And our 2D binning result, also expect it to look kind of like this, because again, this is radial. So what the 2D binning result did is, as we collected things into these bins, we took the maximum value. So the biggest radial value that we saw in these bins will be shown. You could also do things like average, right? And there's some interesting things you can do with that. And again, for the 3D example, it actually works kind of like a line out. And it looks almost exactly the same as the first thing. Well, that's because this feature that we're looking at isn't very interesting. It's kind of a 1D thing. But this is a line out effectively. And there's other ways of doing line sampling. So there's a set of extra examples. Before we go to those, I want to talk about path formatting. So this is something that we've been working on in terms of simplifying how all the files are named in Ascent. And because there's, you get out a lot of important things. You get out a lot of images, you get out HDF5 files, what have you. And we wanted to make it a little bit easier for people to be able to name those. Prescribe a way of naming them when you run the simulation code to help you get all the right formats for the file names themselves. So these are a set of examples that show that. There's fundamentally 3 different ways that we do this. So the default way is if the cycle is provided, it's used. If it's not provided, there's something called the family, which is basically a monotonically increasing number. And you can also use the time that's published in order to name all your files. So we're going to use braid, and we're going to show different examples here in terms of how you can impact what the file names are by just making a couple different choices, right? So in this case, we're using a cycle trigger because we want to only do things at time 200, because that'll help us with thinking about what our output values will be. And we're we're creating a mesh. We're basically just changing the cycle. And let's see what we have here. And then we expect this particular trigger to fire. Again, so there's different ways that we can set up the formatting. So let's look at the actions here. So in this case, this is a default way of naming the images that are going to be rendered. This is another way you can do it. You can use like a old printf style here, and that will use cycle. Or you can say, hey, I want to use cycle and I want to have a custom formatting. So when we run this guy and we look at this, we see we have all these different flavors of file formats. So it's just to give you flexibility and control over what these look like. You can also use time, right? So time is something that's optionally published in a mesh. So if you want to know number of microseconds or number of seconds or whatever you can use that in the file name through this time format here, right? So if we looked at the time actions, we would see that we're using this is a C++ FMT style format screen, which is similar to like, printf, but just a little bit more sophisticated. So we can either use time with some default padding and spacing, or we can be very prescriptive and say, I want, 0.5.1 floating point, or I can even convert it to an integer, all using these things. So if I run this guy and we look, you see here's all the different cases, right? So these are the cases that came out of the default. These are the cases that came out of us being picky about the floating point format. And these are the cases that we got by forcing an int. I do recommend you always publishing cycle. Cycle is your own, key to the kingdom in terms of your simulation solver's state. If you don't do that though, Ascent will use what's called family. So basically, this is a concept that Visit has too. It's going to start with 0, and then over time, it's going to look and see if you have existing files and not write over them. It's going to increment a number, right? So in this example here, we demonstrate that. So when we render, it basically is going to start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if we don't clear up, let's see here if we run again. Yeah, so if we run this again, you'll notice that it actually figures out, well, 4 is the biggest one. So I'm going to start appending at 5, 6, 7, 8. The goal here is that we don't want to overwrite things if we don't know. If you're providing a cycle or time, right, those are unique things. You probably don't want multiple things at the same cycle or time. If we don't really know what's going on, we don't want to overwrite files. So this family option is a way to get away from that. So we have the extra examples. We're coming to the end here. I know it's been a lot of content, so I'm gonna leave those up to yourself if you'd like to play with those. And I think for the last few minutes here, we can save time for questions. I haven't seen the chat in a while. Does anyone have any questions? So yeah, so first I want to thank Justin and thank Nicole for helping present this, and also Tara and Christy for helping set this up. So, but let's see, we got questions. Yes, okay. So the question was about getting the plot. So yeah, actually in the Ascent info, the plot that shows the data flow network, in the Ascent info, there's actually a key in there called like flow.html, and you can save that out to an HTML file, and then you can get it. But any other questions about Ascent? So I can keep these open for probably about another hour or so. I'll do that, and so I'll be shutting them down around around noon Pacific time. And you can run these yourself through the Docker. If you have Docker, you can run that. You should be able to run these yourself pretty easily. The Docker container or the Docker instance of image that we provide should run on Mac OS X for ARM and also for Windows on x86, or well, Linux as well. Okay. If that's all, thank you all for joining us today. If you should be able to get in touch with us on GitHub. So we're, Ascent DAV. Yes, we do have a public repo for the for these. Okay, so real quickly, if you want to see, so all the exercises are part of Ascent itself. So they're actually under source, examples, and then there's tutorial. And you'll find, so effectively this is where it is. Oh, you don't have the 11th Jupyter notebook? Okay, so that's interesting. So they all should be running the same thing. Did other people not have the 11th Jupyter notebook? Maybe the update. Maybe I pushed an older version. Using Docker. So what might have happened is I think the pull, yeah. So I think I accidentally had the wrong command. You need to pull latest. I apologize for that. That's something we need to fix. I developed as an old tag. So you can pull latest or you can pull 0.9.4. And that's the one that we released last week. So I missed updating that. I apologize. Let's see. Less of a question. So yeah, so that's correct. I understand it does feel more like post hoc. We do have, so that's really because we value teaching people how to use the interface more. So we do have Cloverleaf examples that are built in as well, which is a simulation code. And I think the thing is that we value covering the different features, and it's much harder to do all of those different things with even with a proxy. But I do understand. So in Python, in Python, you don't really need to do everything is synchronous. So basically, it would look exactly the same, right? As this case here, where instead of, well, I guess the deal is we are generating the data right on the fly in the Python notebook, and we're handing it in, right? So the only difference would be in the simulation, you would be running a separate simulation executable, and then you would be probably running YAML files, more interact, basically providing YAML files for each one. So I do understand that. Understand that. I appreciate that comment. Okay, so there's a question of, yeah, so Cloverleaf examples. Actually, if you go into tutorial, there are Cloverleaf demos. Yeah, so that's here. And Cloverleaf itself is a Fortran application that you run. So when you do these different ones, so what we provide is we provide the YAML files that you set those when you run Cloverleaf. You basically call those ascent_actions, and then it will run those things. So Contour is another example here. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I think we'll hang on here a little bit, but I think we're getting to the end. I appreciate. Okay, what's the most interesting application Ascent has been used for? So I think for us, we're visualization people, so we like making lots of fun pictures. So in doing some of these large scale like Raleigh-Taylor instability simulations, or some of the things that are related to the NIF laser, so making pictures of those things and getting data extracts from those things have been, I think, the most fun. We're also using it increasingly to build basically as an intermediate step for getting reduced data out for building machine learning models. So folks will run a simulation code, run Ascent as the in situ processing, and use that to greatly reduce the data, either by doing a rendering or by doing like a resampling, and then take that bulk of data and train a machine learning model on it. And now you have a surrogate for an expensive simulation that you can kind of in real time play with. So that's been another really good use case. The benefit of doing those things with something like Ascent or even a tool like Visit is that they understand a really wide range of data formats, right? So since the simulation codes are used to talking to these tools, and Conduit provides a way of us sharing that easily sharing mesh data. If you have a complicated situation where you have an AMR mesh or you have some sort of unstructured grid or polyhedral grid, you Ascent knows how to handle all those, so it can throw away data and it can reduce data for you, or do ray tracing for you, and be kind of the normalizer before you do machine learning. So that's a cool one. So people don't use Ascent as primary I/O. So I think it's using. So okay, let me answer your second question first. I think using Ascent for ad hoc is actually not a bad deal. It's actually pretty good, right? So it's not an interactive tool like Ascent, but we have a tool called Ascent, or sorry, not interactive tool like Visit. I apologize. I'm kidding. It's but we have this tool called Ascent Replay that allows you to, if you've saved data out, you can use Ascent actions, or some people use Jupyter notebooks to do this semi-interactively. People using it as the primary I/O, so people typically don't do that because they want to do more, they want to have more data than just their mesh data, right? So you only really publish mesh data to Ascent. Some simulation codes use Ascent as their way of writing what they call visualization dumps, right? So they're basically dumps that have a reduced set of fields. There are other tools in our toolbox that we have, like the Ascent toolkit, that also use Conduit to do checkpoint restart, and that's a tool that can help you kind of organize a little bit more data as opposed to just the mesh data, because when simulation codes get complicated, there's a lot of control logic and things that you're going to want to store in there. But folks do use Ascent as like a visualization dump capability, so don't have to write a custom visualization dump routines, because Ascent can do things like sub-select fields and stuff like that. Yeah. But I do think Conduit does help with I/O in general, so that's another thing to think about if you're Conduit, and also Ascent Toolkit, which there's a tutorial for that later in the series. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate all the questions. I appreciate folks sticking it out with us and learning. If you have any, again, if you want to get in touch with us, you can go to where Alpine-DAV Ascent is, where our repo is. It'll be in the slides too. And yeah, if you have any problems with anything, getting started or anything else, just let us know. We're happy to help you out, either through GitHub issues or through discussions or what have you. And we're a small team, but we love to hear people using our tools. So thank you so much.